back in 2019, the world was introduced to a documentary titled The Biggest Little Farm. And it happened to be around that time that my amazing wife, Steph Tuss, the CEO of Life Is Now, turned me on to watching it. At first I resisted, but when I saw it for the first time, the emotions I felt were unlike anything else. It's an amazing look at how hard work, desire, commitment to a vision, and dedication, along with the help of some very important mentors, can get you to where you need to go. So come in as we talk all about the acres of wisdom that we gleaned from The Biggest Little Farm.
All right.
Successful people learn how to make their mind work for them. I'm David Nagel, and this is the Successful Mind Podcast.
Hey everyone, DT here, and welcome to another Full Throttle Thursday here on the Successful Mind Podcast. You may notice across from me today is not David, but it's Steph, the CEO of Life Is Now, Steph Tuss, and my beautiful wife. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks.
I'm glad to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Well, part of the reason you're in this seat is because a couple weeks ago, we had Earth Day, and I don't know if people make a big deal out of Earth Day. I think it's important to celebrate the Earth whenever we can. But on that day, they released a sort of a follow-up to the documentary, and your favorite documentary, I would assume, of all time, The Biggest Little Farm.
Yes.
Which is a documentary that you turned me on to that I initially resisted it because I think we had this conversation where sometimes when people tell you to watch something, you sort of dig in and say, no, I don't want to do that. But then when I finally saw it, I saw exactly what you were talking about. So what we figured we would do for this Full Throttle Thursday is have a little conversation about The Biggest Little Farm and, more importantly, the amazing lessons that you can glean from watching this beautifully shot film. Just to give a little backstory for the listeners who may not know about this particular documentary, it was called The Biggest Little Farm, came out in 2019. If you haven't seen it and if you want to see it, you may want to put this podcast down for now and come back and listen, because there is definitely going to be some spoilers coming out here because we can't really talk about the film that came out 3 years ago without spoiling some of it. So push pause right now, go watch it. You can find it on Apple, purchase it. I'd recommend it. There's some beautifully after extras that you should watch, as well as the film itself. And then, of course, there's The Biggest Little Farm, The Return, that came out on Disney Plus, leading into a series on Nat Geo and all sorts of crazy things. So if you haven't yet watched it, definitely put it down right now and come back and see us. So
we're going to spoil the whole thing.
We're going to spoil the whole thing. Well, you're going to spoil the whole thing because you're the one who was educating me on all these amazing lessons from this film. So let's start there. When you go back and think about The Biggest Little Farm, and you've seen it multiple times now, what are the things that jump out at you the most?
So I first saw this movie on a flight, actually. It was back in, I think it was July of 2019. And we were flying to Montana. We fly to Montana every summer to hang out with family. Plus, it's Montana, and who doesn't love Montana? But I saw it on the plane, and I had such a reaction to this documentary. Like, I sat in my seat and sobbed. And it's not a sad documentary. It's actually a really feel-good documentary. But I think the reason that I had the reaction that I did was kind of the same reason I had the reaction to David when I first heard him. When you hear truth and when you see truth, it just, I don't know, you feel it. It's like an arrow through your heart. And there were so many things that happened in my brain during that documentary. And I've had multiple conversations with our clients about this. It's come up in conversation with our kids. It's come up in conversation with our team. And I think that just based on my own personal background, I saw things in this movie that other people may not have seen. So first of all, I have a little bit of a history in farming.
You do?
Tell
us more about this.
So I come from a long line of Norwegian farmers. My grandparents were immigrants and settled in Wisconsin, in central pretty much like south central Wisconsin. And they were dairy farmers. My grandma and grandpa were dairy farmers, and they had animals, and they had a really beautiful farm. And I would spend summers. I'm getting emotional.
Today's
an emotional day.
Yeah.
But I would spend summers there with them. And I would, sit on the farm steps and watch them, milk the cows. And I would take the slop to the pigs, and I would walk around the property, and I would go with my uncles to bring the cows in from pasture. So I have like a love, and I have so many great memories of being a child on a farm that I think it tapped into that piece. I've got a real tie to nature. I love nature. I love being outdoors. Whenever I'm feeling a little bit lost, I'll go and, just be outside. I know a lot of people feel that same way, but for whatever reason, this movie really hit me hard, kind of like right through my heart and right in between my eyes at the same time. And I think the other reason that it did is because I have such a passion for universal truth. And the entire movie is about universal truth. You can see the laws in every single aspect of this movie. And we teach the laws in context of business, right? You hear David teach about the law of polarity. You hear David teach about the law of cause and effect and how it applies to business. But it applies to every single thing in life. Like it doesn't discriminate. In one area, the laws work, and in one area, the laws don't work. They work in every area of life in general. I mean, the biggest tenet of the laws is everything is for more life. And there isn't a better example of that than in this movie. And I just kept seeing example after example of these laws. This was a dream of two people. I think it's interesting that in the documentary, they talk about how they had wanted to do this for a while.
Right. It wasn't just something that just came up.
Right. So it's Molly and John.
Chester.
Molly was a food vlogger at the time when vlogs were a thing. She was a private chef and food vlogger. She has a real passion for food and nutrients in food and sharing that message. And John was a wildlife photographer, videographer. I mean, he had a pretty prolific career in California, where he would be gone for weeks on end documenting wildlife. So they had both had this dream of, well, mainly Molly, honestly, had this dream of having a farm, but they didn't have the means to be able to do that. They didn't know how, and they didn't have the money. And I mean, it's a big endeavor to start a farm, right? Like,
it's not like you're just buying a piece of land and it just automatically becomes a farm. Like when people go out searching for houses, they buy a house and they've got a house. This comes with a whole set of challenges.
Yeah.
And quite a bit of money.
Yeah. So they had wanted to do this for quite some time, but never could see the how, right? So I think everybody can relate to that, having a deep desire, but then not acting on it because you can't see the how. But the first lesson in this is that if you have a desire, then the way is also present, because nothing is created in halves, right? Everything is created in a whole. So that means there's no up without a down. There's no left without a right. There's no problems without a solution. There's no desire without the ability to bring that desire in also present at the same time. But they couldn't see it, right? You don't know what you don't know. Sure. Which is the case with so many people. You have this desire and you think about it and it's in your secret thoughts and you hear yourself, like, oh, wow, this is something I'd really love to do, but nah, maybe later. You put it off. When we figure it out, that's not really realistic. That's not responsible. That's not feasible right now. And John had an experience where he was doing some video coverage of a dog hoarder in the LA area because they were living in Santa Monica at the time. And this woman was hoarding, I think like somewhere over 200 dogs or something crazy.
Insane amount of dogs.
A lot of dogs in her place. And he filmed this dog, this black dog with these bright ice blue eyes, and this dog's name was Todd. They named him Todd. He was so taken by him that they took him back to their apartment. Well, the problem with Todd is that he was a barker.
Which,
we're thankful.
Yes,
we're thankful that our dog is not a barker.
He's not.
He's actually under the table at my feet right now, just like chilling out with us. But Todd was a barker, so every time that they had to leave to go to work or market or whatever, he would bark. And they tried everything to get him to stop barking, and it wouldn't work. But they had made a commitment to this dog, like a real commitment to this dog, that this would be the last home that he would ever have. So an eviction notice showed up, and they had to leave. And they knew that if they moved into another apartment, they would just be repeating the same pattern. So they decided this was the time to go for it. And they decided that they were going to have their farm so that Todd would have a place to live out the rest of his days. And it would also move them forward in their vision for what they wanted to create for themselves. So it took the reason of a dog.
Yes.
They wouldn't do it for themselves, but they would do it for Todd. And they wrote up a business plan.
Yeah.
Wrote up a business plan, and they needed investors because they didn't have any money to invest in a farm. And their idea was that they didn't want to just create a farm. They wanted to create a biodynamic farm. So, a lot of the food that we eat right now comes from monoculture farms, meaning the farm is specific to one thing, that it grows one thing. It grows all raspberries, or it grows all corn, or it grows all soybean. And that's what my grandparents did, right? They were, grow corn to feed the cows, and grow alfalfa to feed the cows, and grow hay for the cows to bed in. And then it was monoculture, like everything is in chunks and focuses on one thing. This farm was wanted to be a biodiverse farm with no outside intervention. So no sprays, no chemicals, no pest control, just organic, biodynamic.
And just nature running its course.
Nature running its course. Yes, nature running its course.
Which sounds simple when we say it out loud, but it's much more difficult than that.
Yeah, exactly. And they found a property just outside of Moore Park, California. It was 200 acres.
200 acres.
Yes. And we did some research. They paid $10.4 million for it. The interesting thing is that they pitched this idea to their friends, and their friends completely made fun of them. Their friends totally, there's a shot in the documentary where they're having a party and their friends show up and they're all wearing pig noses.
Yes. Singing Old MacDonald
to them, right? So they did it anyway. And their friends talked, and one thing led to another, and investors came forward, which gave them the money to purchase this farm. People who were also really passionate about biodynamic farming and kind of bringing the old ecosystem way of farming back into practice. So they purchased this piece of land, which is really, it had been vacant for how long?
I believe it was for sale for 12 years at that point. What I heard.
It had been for sale for 12 years. It was an orchard, I believe.
Primarily they were growing lemons, I believe, on the property. That's what it was.
Yes, but it was dead. The dirt was dead, meaning it was dry, crumbled. There wasn't anything. It was very devoid of life in many pieces. There were lemon trees on the property. In doing some research, we found out that there was actually more things alive on the property than the documentary portrayed, but it was still very dead. The soil was dead. So again, they had no idea what they were doing. They just knew what they wanted. Read books, researched, reached out to experts, and a lot of people, again, told them they were pretty much batshit crazy. You're crazy for doing this. This is not going to work. And they just really stuck to their belief that it was possible, and they stumbled upon a man by the name of Alan York, who came in and explained how this all works. And he talked about this biodynamic farm like a flywheel of life. Once it gets going, everything supports everything else. But the first 7 years were going to be rough. And basically the movie documents the first 7 years, right? So from very beginning to the very end. And the first part of this whole thing was bringing the soil back to life. Because without alive soil, you're not going to have alive plants. Without alive plants, you're not going to have alive animals. And without any of those things, you don't have a profitable farm. So the first focus was on ripping out the monoculture that was there, bringing the soil back to life through a whole bunch of contraptions, worm bins, basically poop tea.
Right.
To spray on the soil to get the microorganisms, to bring
Thriving.
the microorganisms back to feed the cover crops and the trees and plants. And then planting in a way where everything was diverse. Nothing was the same. So you had, 30 different types of stone fruit. You had, everything was different. didn't plant the same thing next to the same thing. The idea is that they all interplay and interact with each other. So they did it. I mean, they brought the soil back to life. And then as the farm got going, they ran into lots of problems. And this is the part, I think, in the movie that impacted me the most, because I'm a big, David talks a lot about the law of polarity, right?
Sure.
He will say it's his favorite law, the law of polarity, because the law of polarity can bring in truth to really any situation. The law of polarity states, like I said in the beginning of this, that there's a polar opposite to each. There's no right without a left. There's no up without a down. There's no problem without a solution. The problem is that we're raised to focus on problems rather than raised to focus and look for solutions. So when these problems came in, you saw them really struggle. And there were all kinds of problems. So I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down. So first was they planted cover crop. So cover crop is what you plant between your fruit trees that is basically weeds. It's like grasses, weeds, flowers, plants. And the idea behind the cover crop is that it keeps the moisture. When it rains, it keeps the water on the ground so that your soil doesn't erode. And it also rejuvenates the soil that then feeds the trees. I am not an environmental biologist, just like disclaimer.
But here's the thing, you sound like you are, which I think is really impressive. Like, this is really good. Go on.
I'm like, you better stop yourself and give a disclaimer, because you're going to get contacted by people that are like, Steph, you said this all wrong. So for what it's worth, not an environmental biologist, but they talked about how this cover crop is beneficial. But then the problem is that the cover crop got so high that they had to bring in mowers. Well, bringing in mowers is an added expense, and it takes time, and it costs money because you have to pay someone a salary. And we're talking about 200 acres, guys. Like, we're not talking about like a yard, right? This is like you're cutting every single day, all day long, to keep on top of the cover crop. Well, Alan said, well, stop mowing, bring in the sheep.
Release the sheep.
And not only did the sheep keep the cover crop at a reasonable length, they also eat and are fed. And they leave behind droppings, which then feed the soil.
So the beginning of the flywheel is starting to take place.
The beginning of the flywheel is starting to take place. Yes. And they saw a problem, and their solution was, we need to cut the grass. But cutting the grass doesn't really add to anything. It just takes away. So instead of cutting the grass, they bring in sheep. Problem, solution. And the solution makes everything better, right? Law of polarity in motion. That was the first time I was like, oh, problem, ding, ding. Solution. If you just take a step back and think about it, right? And at that point, they didn't know what they didn't know, which is a huge theme through this movie, is that they didn't know what they didn't know. They had to find the things that they needed to know that they didn't even know that they were going to need to know.
I'm just wondering how many people are listening to this right now and are saying, oh my gosh, I haven't seen this film, but every single thing you've mentioned to this point is exactly me in where I'm at in my life, my business, my personal life. You talked about desire, you talked about commitment, you talked about hiring a mentor, you talked about family not believing in your vision and making fun of you. And I mean, you look at all the themes up to this point you've talked about. I'm sure every person out there can relate to something that you're saying. I think it's absolutely genius. And we haven't even really gotten to the good stuff yet.
It's what Napoleon Hill calls the sly disguises of opportunity.
Yes.
Right? I think it was Napoleon Hill. Yes. The sly disguises of opportunity, where something happens and it feels like something that it's a bad thing. Like it's defeat. It's a negative thing. But it's actually an opportunity in disguise. If you just get out of the emotion of being like, ugh, right? So the next thing that happens is the cover crop is great, but guess what likes cover crop? Snails. Oh. Snails like cover crop.
Snails.
So in move, like honestly, a gajillion snails.
Million snails.
So many like the sheep had snails on their back, like snails everywhere. And the problem with snails is that they don't just eat cover crop, they also climb the trees and they eat the leaves of the fruit trees. Well, if the fruit trees don't have healthy leaves, then they won't bear fruit. So everyone goes into grabbing buckets and trying to remove these.
Snail after snail after snail.
Hand by hand, picking snails. There's no way they can keep up with all these snails. Like, I don't know how many shots they showed, but literally each tree had hundreds and hundreds of snails.
And they're plucking them off in buckets, one at a time, into the buckets.
Because they can't spray. Because they made the commitment that we're not going to kill things. We're not going to kill these things.
Which was interesting because they were close. Like, John was like, you know, should we just spray? And Molly was like, no, we can't spray.
Like, no.
Yeah, that would totally defeat the purpose of what they're trying to create in this biodiversity unit.
Right. It was one of the commitments they made to themselves. We're not going to do this. We're not going to spray. We're not going to bring in a human element and spray. So they're out there. All of their farmhands are out there with buckets picking these snails up. I mean, it's a huge problem. Yeah. Like, huge problem. And at the same time, they're in a drought. They're in a bit of a drought. So their pond where the ducks wasn't getting any fresh water, and there were a lot of ducks. So what happens when you have a lot of ducks and not a lot of fresh water is that the duck poop turns toxic, and it created a toxic algae bloom. So here they have this problem of these ducks in this pond. They don't know what to do with them. And they have this problem of these snails, and basically the snails are eating all of their profits. Like, if they don't get rid of these snails, the trees aren't going to bear fruit. They're not going to have fruit to sell, bring to the market, make money, you know, keep the farm
sustain
going. So John steps back and he's like, okay, there's got to be something that I don't see here. There's got to be something that I don't understand. And he realizes that what ducks love more than anything are snails. So he moves the ducks from the duck pond to give the duck pond a little bit of a rest from the ducks, and he puts the ducks in the cover crop under the fruit trees. And the ducks take care of the entire population of snails.
Yeah, they go to town.
They bring it down to a completely manageable level. So now you have snails that are eating your trees. You bring in the ducks. The ducks eat the snails. The ducks trample the cover crop. The ducks leave droppings, which then turn into food for the soil, which then turn into food for the trees. And you didn't even, it is 100% the law of polarity in motion. You can never have a problem without a solution. And this goes, we could probably spend an hour talking about all the different things that happen that go directly back to the law of polarity. And I think for me, what I get from knowing and understanding this law and seeing so many examples of this is a sense of comfort, because it means that I can't ever experience a problem without the solution also present. I just have to be in a place where I can see the opportunity, right? Had he gotten really emotional and really, really upset about these two things that are going wrong that people would say he had a right to be upset about. And at this point, I forgot to mention that their mentor, Alan, had passed away. So they didn't even have him to go to say, like, hey, what do we do here? Right? Alan did suggest the sheep. Alan is now gone. So they're on their own. Had John been super emotional, had he been angry, had he been only focused on the problems, he never would have seen that there was a solution to each of these and they were intertwined with each other, that when combined made the farm overall a better place, hence more life.
Right.
Like, it's so beautiful. It's just, there's this, like I said, there's this sense of comfort that happens for me because, we've experienced our share of problems throughout our entire life, throughout our entire journey. And we have clients that experience problems that are, run the gamut, right? But if you can get yourself into a place of being non-emotional about it and not taking it personally and not thinking that, God's punishing you for something,
why me?
Or the universe is trying to get you to stop, then you actually can see that there is an opportunity in every single problem. And this plays out with the fruit comes starlings. Starlings are birds that eat fruit. So 70% of their fruit crop was destroyed by starlings. So what do? They didn't know. They had no idea. They had no idea that hawks eat starlings. Hawks hunt starlings. So hawks came in to control the starling population. They had a huge gopher issue.
Major issue.
huge gopher issue. Gophers go in the ground and they eat the roots of the fruit trees.
Again, affecting the bloom,
the trees, right? These trees, I'm telling you, like what they did to keep fruit, alive was incredible. Yeah. But they,
it is called Apricot Farms, let's be honest.
Apricot Lane Farms,
Stone fruit is a major premise of their operation.
It is Southern California, right?
Yes,
so
correct.
I mean, it's fruit area. But they had this huge issue with gophers. And so you and I were talking about this on the drive-in this morning. They hired...
Yeah, I was listening. They hired 2 to 3 full-time employees. Their only job on the farm was to just eradicate the gopher population. Because John had mentioned that for a year, they tried to humanely trap and release, which is what a sustainable farm would do because they don't want to hurt any of the animals. It endangers the ecosystem. But they could not keep up. So they got to a point where they had to hire people whose sole job and sole focus was to kill the gophers and remove them from the property. They could not keep up. Over the course of the year, they were only able to remove 9,000 gophers over the course of an entire year, which leads them to bringing, which actually at the cost is going to be around $300,000 when you start paying salaries over the course of time it's going to take to completely bring this down to a manageable level. Yeah. So instead, they decide to bring the flywheel in and rely on nature. So what do?
They install barn owl houses.
Yes. So $750 worth of lumber and labor to put these barn owl houses on the property. And what does that do? Brings these barn owls in that start to eradicate the population of gophers. And they say in the doc, they removed 15,000 gophers. These barn owls removed 15,000 gophers. John said in a podcast I listened to, it was actually closer to 30,000 when you stop and think about it. And at one point in time, there were 87 barn owls that were coming in and out of that property, feasting on these gophers. And the gophers have a purpose. You want to keep that population there, but you don't want it so overrun to where it starts damaging your fruit trees.
Right. The gophers are good for the soil in moderation. Right. I guess the phrase is they aerate the soil. They obviously poop in the soil, which then feeds the soil. But too many of them and it kills all your fruit trees. So $750 worth of wood.
Yeah, instead of paying $300,000 worth of salary to eradicate the same amount of gophers. Fascinating stuff. Every problem has a solution.
Every problem has a solution. It's the law of polarity, right? And then the snakes come in. And there's a whole section on coyotes. I'm not going to go into that. I'll let you watch that section yourself. But it's fascinating how something that seems like such a problem is actually part of a solution.
Right. That's
if
so
you
true.
just take the time to step back and see it in a different way.
It's like the fly who is beating its head against the window, trying to get out back to its home. If it would just stop for a moment and take a step back and look, it would see that the window is slightly ajar over to the side and it could fly right out. I mean, really, that's what you're seeing here. Every problem, when you were speaking about that, Steph, I was thinking about, how, I've learned to be less reactionary during times of like uncomfortable crisis rather than, because that was my MO. That's how I used to deal with things. It's just, I react in the moment. Yeah. And that's not usually good for anybody. Because you can't see the solution. All you can see is the problem, like you said, and all you can resort to is, why me, such a victim? It gets kind of drippy, gross. So for me, being able to stop, take a breath, observe what's happening, and then proceed with some sort of a solution. It sounds easy, people. It really isn't. But I envision that stop sign in my head, like stop and think about this for a moment, because you can freak out, like my dad used to do when something wouldn't work and just throw shit around. Or you could take a break, take a breath, think about what you're doing and make like an educated step forward rather than reacting and making things, compounding them worse.
The final little piece to this little story that was super impactful for me is that there's a gift in everything, right? There's a gift in even the like saddest, worst situations. So they were having an issue with coyotes getting into their chickens, and they had killed hundreds of chickens at that point. And John had shot one of the coyotes and felt horrific about it.
He was traumatized by that for sure.
But they could not figure out a way to keep their chickens safe. They tried some Great Pyrenees, but it appeared that the dogs would chase the chickens, which is not good because stressed chickens don't lay eggs, and you don't want the dogs to kill. You don't want to put a predator in with chickens. So that was happening. At the same time, there was this really interesting relationship developing between their pig by the name of Emma and a kind of a outcast rooster that they named Greasy. And this rooster looked greasy.
He was rough.
He was a rough looking rooster.
Rough-looking rooster.
But Emma and Greasy were they were friends. Greasy would sleep in Emma's pig pen. And they were just a part of each other's lives. There's a picture of Greasy actually standing on top of Emma, which is, so endearing and so sweet. Yeah. Well, one night John went out to feed Emma and he realized that Greasy wasn't there. And he was looking all over for Greasy and couldn't find him. And he noticed there were some feathers in a fence, and he looked over the fence, and it turned out that Greasy had somehow gotten killed by one of their guardian dogs. So they had Great Pyrenees dogs that would protect their herd of sheep and their lambs from predators. And somehow the dogs had gotten a hold of Greasy. And John was really upset about it. He was really, really upset about it. But he noticed that only one of the dogs had blood on him. And the other dog, Rosie, had none of Greasy's blood. So that gave him the idea that maybe Rosie could guard the chickens. And he put Rosie in with the chickens, and they never had a problem with coyotes getting into the chickens again.
So in the loss
of Greasy, he took the time to really observe what happened and noticed something that later became a massive gift and saved thousands of chicken lives, because one of the dogs killed Greasy and the other one didn't. So Rosie became the chicken guardian, and there were no other issues with coyotes getting into the chickens. She never chased the chickens. They were like her herd. She protected them. But had he been over emotional, had he gotten, really upset and just focused on the fact that Greasy had been killed, he would never have seen the opportunity that lied in that, tragic event.
Yeah, it's that silver lining. I mean, it really is that silver lining in things that you don't often see. And, in our company, David and you yourself always stress the importance of making mistakes, because in order to grow and stretch and to overcome, there has to be mistakes being made. We make mistakes every single day. Yeah. I make mistakes every day of my life. And, it's not like we, jump on the table and celebrate. Yeah, I screwed up today, but it does give you an opportunity to realize that without the failure, you aren't able to get to the place you want to get to, because it allows you to grow. And I think we could go through and talk about all of the failures that the Apricot Lane Farms went through in the years that this was documented, and still to this day continue to do so. And listening to John talk, just in an interview that he did back in 2019, it took him a good 5 or 6 years to get to the place where he was no longer judging his failures. He welcomed the failure because it allowed him the next evolution of the farm, the next step on where they needed to go, the next solution to get rid of the snails, or to get rid of the gophers, or to enhance the stone fruit crop, or to fix the fruit basket. It took him a long time to get there. Whereas most people would have just said, this is not for me. Let's go back to the city and go about our lives. They were committed because, and by this time, Todd has since moved on, but they were committed to this, to seeing it all the way through. And now this Biggest Little Farm is this wonderful sensation that's teaching all humans about the importance of biodiversity and what we can do in the age of climate change to be able to help fix our soil. We lived in Southern California. We lived in the Mojave Desert. Mm-hmm. We know how desolate that soil can be. And for miles and miles and miles, it almost like you're on the, on the rover up on the moon, right?
It felt like
but these amazing individuals and a collective of people, I shouldn't just say it's John and Molly. I mean, they had a huge team of volunteers and paid help that would come in and brought this and regenerated this soil. It's really cool to see what it was to what it is now. And other people are starting to follow sort of that MO of creating a farm. It's not easy because it requires a lot of time, requires a lot of effort, requires a lot of capital to be able to get to this point. And we have billions of people on this planet that need food, but the nutrient-rich food that they are producing there, and these other small farms. That's why we love to go to farmers markets. You support these local farmers at a grassroots level, but you also get these delicious high nutrient foods. I just love that John, getting back to the point, is that he now welcomes those failures because he knows there's a gift in everything. And it took him a very long time to get there, but now he doesn't stress out as much as he used to, because now he knows that he can stop, take a breath, and observe his surroundings before he proceeds ahead.
So many lessons in this movie. Embrace your failures, sunshine your failures, talk about them, learn from them, and just know that if you've got a desire, the way is there, and if you've got a problem, the solution is there as well.
Absolutely.
So,
and it's the fragility that we are in this life. You only get one chance, so live it to the best of your abilities. And, it's great to see you, having been this little girl sitting on the steps of Sorensen Lane, looking and observing. And you were able to take myself and the girls out there to see this farm. It's since changed hands, but we were able to go up on the property and look out there. And you were struck with emotion then at that time, looking out and remembering all those good times, because you used to take milk directly out of the bulk tank. Like, you used to do all these amazing things on the farm and feeding the animals and the food. Oh man, your grandma used to just make some amazing foods. I would put on pounds just going into her kitchen before I even ate anything. But it was cool to see that and take pictures and to see what it was like, and to see how that rolling farmland in the central part of our country is so vital to getting it into our hands. And my big ask for our listeners would be, first of all, watch this movie. Like, you got to see this movie.
Drop everything and watch this
Watch
movie.
this film. This documentary is great. And then follow it up with The Return, which is just a short form little check-in that is leading up to them releasing a series that's going to happen on Nat Geo, where they're going to follow a little bit more of this story. And they've got great Instagram stories and things out there. I would encourage people to do that first, but I would also encourage them to do your best to, source locally amazing food. Like, you can go and the farm to table thing, I think, has been probably overused a little bit, because how many people, like, you can put farm to table, but is it really farm to table? When you go to a farmer's market and when you see all those little booths there and they're selling all these things, go check it out. You can get it in your grocery store, but it's so much better to get it at the local market. That's what I would recommend. So, any last words as you send us out here on your biggest little farm adventure?
No, just pay attention.
Pay attention, because you can learn a lot from a pig, from a gopher, from a barn owl. There's things that you can learn and apply to your own life.
I mean, if you're ever confused, all you need to do is look to nature. Like, it's all you need. There's all the answers, right? Like, all the answers are found in nature. It's really comforting to me to know that, like, I'll never have a problem that doesn't come also with a solution, or that I can't handle. And I'll never have a desire that I can't ever have. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a good way to send it off. Well, I appreciate you coming in here.
Thanks for having me.
Sharing this with us. I'm sure our audience is going to get a wonderful, wonderful gift by listening to you talk about the biggest little farm. So thanks, Steph.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Well, there you have it, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Full Throttle Thursday, The Biggest Little Farm. Do yourself a favor. Go and watch this documentary right now. It's not only beautifully shot, but it's beautifully crafted and aligns so well with what David teaches around universal law. Do us a favor. Smash that like button down below. Ring that bell so you get more content like this. And please, above all, continue to come back and listen to these amazing shows. We absolutely love bringing them to you, and we can't wait until we do it all again. So until the next time, we'll see you on the Successful Mind Podcast. Take care.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Successful Mind Podcast. And if you like what you heard and you want to know more, go to davidnagel.com/free stuff.